Very good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming to tonight's talk. The reasons, I suppose, why I'm so invested and interested in this topic, you can read on this screen. It's literally what we do is the really short answer. Even many years ago in 2013, and it only feels like yesterday, but quite some time ago, I put together a book that I had intended to be about evangelism, and that ended up actually being about how a parish can welcome people, which is one of the prerequisites to evangelism that we'll be talking about later on. So having gone through the conversion process, like many of us here, having served in parishes where welcoming the other is part of what we do. And as part of my academic research, evangelism is one of the areas that I've put a lot of time into trying to understand as well as I can. And hopefully we'll be able to convey some of that tonight. The thing that I will be talking about tonight will be how evangelism can be done by Orthodox Christians, by Orthodox Christian laity, in 21st century Australia. This is necessarily going to include things like what is mission? What is evangelism? How does this compare to wrong ideas of evangelism? And there's a heap of things that I won't be talking about, partly because other people have addressed them so well, partly because I've addressed them before. So there's no point, rehashing them. I can just point you to the YouTube video where we talked about it. So we won't be talking about catechism. We won't be talking about pastoral care or anything that comes under the heading of internal mission. It's not what we're doing. These are wonderful things. They are necessary things, but they're not evangelism. And so we're going to try to keep that focus tonight. We're also not going to talk about evangelism overseas. There's heaps we can talk about. But if we're going to have a targeted talk tonight, then we're focusing on how it can happen in our own country, in our own context. And as we said before, we'll have our Q&A session at the end of the talk. So let's start off. Firstly, what is mission? What is missiology? Again, there's so much that we can be talking about for tonight. When we talk about missions and missionary and everything to do with that term, what we're looking at is mission in the terms of mission statement. So what should we be about? What the church should be about is missiology. So the mistake, and it's all too common, it's a mistake that I made, is the idea that missiology is a study of evangelism and missionary is synonymous with evangelist, whole different world. You can see in that blue box the different areas that missiology can be. There's a lot of cool stuff there. And as you can see, we're looking at one of those 10 categories. So missiology is attempting to answer what is the purpose of the church? What should the church be all about? One of those things is evangelism, and that's where we find ourselves tonight. Evangelism is part of what we're calling the process of conversion. And there's a heap of things that come in here. I've put 10 things that are here, 10 steps along the way, loosely grouped. So outreach and evangelism, we've got outreach which is to bring the faith closer to the non-Orthodox. Outreach may include, it can include things like our SEO for our websites. It can include wearing our cassocks to the supermarket for clergy. It can include having a stall at the various market days. Outreach. Whereas evangelism includes talking to someone, includes sharing the gospel with someone. Usually this requires words. But this is where evangelism comes in. The next step after that is welcoming and hospitality. So this is where a person has heard about the gospel, or at least heard that the church exists, and they walk through the door. So when we're welcoming, we're greeting a visitor. Hospitality goes the next step. So it's not just welcome, we're glad you're here, but also to welcome someone into the community. The next step after that, so a person has, they've successfully gone through being a visitor, being a guest, and then are looking to be an inquirer, or are becoming an inquirer. So where we are here is about catechism and formation. And these two, as I think most of us here know, these two run hand in hand. Catechism is education about the faith. This is data. And formation is about changing our life in accordance with the faith. Things that we would have as formation are being in services, looking around and seeing what other people do. These are things, when you cross yourself, you know, there's a couple of times, and we can talk about general rules, but when does a parish cross itself? For that, we look around and we see what is the parish doing, and this is formation. This is how a whole community is involved in catechizing a person, in bringing them in. After this, baptism and chrismation. We know about these sacraments where baptism is dying and rising with Christ, becoming a Christian. Chrismation is to receive the Holy Spirit. We then receive the other sacraments and continue on our life as Orthodox Christians with spiritual growth, which is to grow towards heaven. And that's a very, very general term because it's a very, very general process. And pastoral care, which is where we ask for or we need a bit of help. And this is where one's Christian leaders come in. This is the priest of the parish. And their role is to help existing Orthodox Christians in the journey towards heaven. So now that we've situated evangelism as a facet of missiology and as part of the process of conversion. To define evangelism can be very straightforward. It's to share the good news with those who haven't heard it. Evangelism, there's a lot of things that evangelism is not. We sometimes respond to the term evangelism because we're thinking of concepts of evangelism that are foreign to Orthodoxy. And so we think that we can be tempted to think that evangelism is therefore foreign to Orthodoxy. There are countless counterexamples to this all through church history. Evangelism is a part of the church. It works as a natural expression of our overflowing faith in Christ. What that means is going to take up most of the remainder of my talk, but that it is a natural expression of our overflowing faith in Christ. Right now, I want to focus a little bit more on the definition of good news. There's a lot of things that good news could be if we were just seeing it in a sentence. Gospel literally comes from good news as an Old English term. It's not common that our theological terms come from like Old Saxon, but this is one of them. And God's spell at the time meant good talk or good tale or good story, or alternatively, in this context, message of God, a talk from the good who is God. It's a direct translation of, I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Latin term bona annunciatio, which is a translation of Evangelion, which is good message. An angel is a messenger, Ev is good, and so good message. Evangelism is about spreading the good news. It's not to share bad news. It's not to share the news that you're all sinners and you're going to die and you're going to hell unless you get my fire insurance. And all you need to do is say a prayer. All of those statements are not good news. It's not to share ordinary news or earthly news. It's not to say we are like-minded individuals and we're going to make this world a better place. That's not good news. That's a side effect of Christianity, but that in itself is not good news. And lastly, evangelism is not to have the good news and to keep it to yourself. So each of those things are important, that it is good news that is shared with others. Now, it would take much, much too long to summarize how it is that we say that the Orthodox Church has evangelism as part of its DNA. I did a very quick Google search and culled a number of Bible verses and still came up with the church is called to evangelism. The fact that I'm saying the church is called to evangelism is very important. I'm going to come back to that. The clearest verses I think we can find in Acts. We can see it in Paul's letters, and we can see it very, very clearly in each of the Great Commission and related terms. So when Jesus rose from the dead and he was in his final days post-resurrection before he would ascend to heaven, he gave the apostles particular commands: go ye therefore into all the world, baptizing, making disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them, and I will be with you. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So it's slightly different between Matthew and Mark, but it's the same idea. Still, evangelism is a necessary part of what the church does. I'll let you read those Bible verses at your leisure, but I think we can take it as read that the church as a whole is called to evangelism. When we're looking to the question of evangelism, it necessarily brings us to what is the gospel. And there's so many ways that we can conceptualize what is the gospel. Many, many. I've put a few down on this slide. If we are talking to people who have an understanding of Christianity and comes from outside Orthodoxy, but an understanding of who Jesus is and what he did for us, then we can put it more simply as that Jesus, a historical person, that this historical man is God, that he is the Messiah who rose from the dead, and that therefore we can be saved from sin. There's a lot to unpack there, but for someone who already has an understanding of Christianity, this would be a good way to go. We could also put it simply that in a broken world, in a world with problems aplenty, that seems to be going from problem to problem, there is a better way. And that this better way was given to us 2,000 years ago, because it's not just about this world, but about the world to come. We can put it more that God loved us too much to let us be away from him, so he came to bring us back to him. Each of these is good news. It's rescue from the world around us. You'll notice that these don't talk about political benefit. We make a very bad political party. There are ways that our Christian life should be ordered. There are ways that our community should be ordered. But this isn't of itself good news. This isn't the purpose of being Christian. We're Christian to follow Christ. We don't talk about the good news as being rules towards righteousness. like it's many, many boxes to tick off and then we're good. Because it doesn't work like that. The good news is that we can be with our Maker. We can be restored to being truly human. This is good news. When we talk about evangelism, there's a few necessary preconditions. And Bishop Irenae, who is the Bishop of London and Western Europe in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, gives a talk that discusses this in a great amount of detail. It's a talk called The Orthodox Approach to Mission, which focuses a lot on preconditions of mission to occur. And I'll put the link on the slide. It's about the person, the parish, and the priest. There's a few necessary preconditions. So for the person of someone who wishes to share the gospel with others, we're looking essentially that a person is living out Orthodox Christianity. We're expecting them to be Orthodox Christian in faith and life, to be attempting to live their Christian faith. Notice that that's not always succeeding. It's understood that we will be trying and sometimes we will be struggling, but we're doing our best. We should be partaking of the sacraments, striving towards theosis. And an important one is to have humility about evangelism, to put what we do in the proper perspective. When we look to the person of the priest, we're looking to someone who is open to newcomers attending. However it is that we define newcomers. And this is going to vary somewhat from parish to parish. Someone who is ready to welcome, who is able to connect newcomers with someone who can teach them their faith, who is able to connect newcomers with pastoral care. And usually this is from the priests themselves. Very, very large parishes can be different in that regard. But generally, it will be with the priests themselves. And lastly, that the priest is able to encourage in the faith. This seems like an appropriate point to suggest one thing about that is a Orthodox understanding of evangelism, which is that it happens under guidance. We don't ourselves decide to go forth. We place ourselves under the proper authorities to make sure that we're not going off the rails. And so if we were going into foreign lands, then we would be asking a bishop. If we are working in our own parish, then we must be speaking with the priest of that parish. We must be working in with the vision for that parish. And this is how everything can work together for good. Lastly, the parish community. So for evangelism to have, I guess, a landing place, there needs to be the parish community desiring to welcome outsiders. So a community needs to want to welcome those who are other. And there are, again, many ways where that can be defined. The services need to have it understood that outsiders will be present. What will be needed to welcome them in? There needs to be hospitality for the outsider, again, however that's defined. There needs to be the ability to not just find a place for the outsider, but to make the outsider into an insider. And lastly, that the community is one of love and fellowship. I'm really not trying to advertise for my book, but I literally talked about this a lot in my book. So for ways of practical ways that a parish can can move towards hospitality and welcoming and simply receiving those that God sends to a parish, that book is a very good starting point. You may have noticed that I'm using words like outsider and newcomer and insider. And there's many, many ways that this can be defined. Sometimes a person is an outsider because they believe differently. Sometimes it's because they speak a different language. Sometimes it's for any one of a number of reasons. If evangelism is to happen, then we need to make the outsider an insider, which means to welcome those who do things a little bit differently, to have patience, to have that self-sacrifice as both work together to move towards heaven. So we've talked a lot about preconditions. And it can feel a little like we're kicking the can down the road. But when we're talking about evangelism, there's usually two ways that we can go. One way is, how can we even do that? This is a sunburnt, God-forsaken country. People don't seem to want to talk about anything spiritual. And yet on the other hand, there can be so many alternatives and options that we're paralyzed by how many things could be done if only we were able to get started on one. So rather than that, I'm going to talk about some premises for how our laity, that is how Orthodox laity, can evangelize in Australia. There's 4 premises in total. The first premise is that a person has successfully evangelized if they have presented the gospel in a way that the other person can accept. That's successful evangelism. It's not to convert the other person. That's not on us. Nowhere are we told that conversion is the success measure, but simply that we're sharing. The difficulty with this, and you can see this in the responsibility section on this slide, is that presenting in a way that the other can accept can be a huge challenge. That shouldn't stop us from trying, but it is something to work towards. It may mean analogies. It may mean explanations. It'll probably mean uncomfortable questions from way out left field that you hadn't thought of before. It's going to require empathy, trying to understand where the other person is coming from. And ultimately, it just requires understanding their position so that you're able to speak into it. I'll give you an example of where presenting the gospel as we want to doesn't work. Sometimes they talk about Australia being a post-Christian culture. This post-Christian culture has a memory of Christianity, but it isn't there now for whatever reason. And so we have these vestiges of when upwards of 80% of the population were Christian. Not just Christian, but of a particular denomination. So we have things like public holidays for Christmas, for the 25th of December, and public holidays for the Easter long weekend. And this is good. That doesn't mean that Christmas is connected to the birth of Jesus. It certainly doesn't mean that Christmas is connected with the redemption of humanity. There might be an understanding that this is connected to an event that occurred a long time ago and goody, we get a public holiday. But if that's not connected to redemption, then the gospel hasn't been presented. It hasn't been presented in a way that can be accepted. Same goes for Easter. Premise 2 about lay Orthodox evangelism. The church is called to evangelism. A few, and this is going to be a small number, are called to be like Saints Peter and Paul. For most people, it's much more simple than that. It's simply talking about the gospel, sharing with people that are around us. And you can see the proportion in Scripture, the Scriptures itself, because you had several thousand people in the church. Even in its early days, thousands were converted in a day because of the preaching of St. Peter. And yet we hear about very, very few who stand beside St. Peter in order to preach alongside him. You hear about Paul and Apollos and Peter, and there's others, but there's not a large amount. So we don't need to feel that the only way to evangelize is by going to Rundle Mall and having a loudspeaker. That if for no other reason, then it's not a very good method of evangelism in Australia. Very culturally inappropriate. Most are simply called to talk about the gospel. On the good side, that's a lot easier. Don't have to worry about public speaking. There's a lot of things you don't have to worry about. The responsibility, though, is that the people that we're having the conversation with are usually people who know us and who know us pretty well. This isn't about go up to people who we don't know. This is generally about people that we're already in contact with. Family, friends, possibly acquaintances, but family and friends predominantly. The third premise: when gossiping the gospel, most of the work isn't in talking. It's in being silent and listening, firstly. Listening, and then speaking when invited. Things like, I don't know, what do you think, when someone's come to the end of a train of thought? That's an invitation to speak, where you have qualified to do so because you have listened to the full story, because you've given your full attention. You're able to respond. And lastly, that we must always be ready to give a defense for our hope. St. Peter talks about this in his epistle. Be ready to give a defense for your hope. Firstly, you notice how that's a defense, not an attack? So when someone asks, why is it that you have hope despite all the things that are going on around us, whether it's 1st century or 21st century, we're able to tell them. We're able to tell them that this isn't the end. We're able to tell them that there's something beyond this. Some will be called to give a structured defense and systematically draw that together. That's called apologetics, and that's not evangelism. The second thing is, we need to give a reason for the hope that is within us. That doesn't mean we need to go to seminary to do so. We don't need a formal theological education to explain why it is that we have faith, why it is that we have faith that Jesus is the Christ. We can simply tell our story, why it is that we believe this, why it is that we live the way that we do. The responsibility then, that we need to pray that we need to be ready, even when we don't see the immediate need for that readiness. We like action, but sometimes we just need to be ready. So I've talked about a number of premises of how evangelism can and should occur. Now, a bit of a structure. So step one, and there's 3 parts to this step one. Step one is to prepare, to work on your salvation with fear and trembling. And this is an ongoing thing. All of these preparatory steps are going to be ongoing things. You don't succeed in theosis and then you can get on to anything else. These are things that you do simultaneously. You work here, you work a little bit here and a little bit there. You don't try to fulfill only one commandment and then move on to the next one. We try to live the fullness of the Christian life. So we're working on our salvation with fear and trembling, we're praying, and we're doing our part in our church community. Those 3 things are our preparation. So let's go into that in a bit more detail. When we're working on our salvation with fear and trembling, this includes elements of spirituality. This is prayer and fasting and charity, reading scripture, and partaking of the sacraments, making sure that you're part of weekly worship as a part of your prayer. And to be under the direction of your priest. It's very, very important because we've seen many times that sometimes evangelism becomes a tool to inspire pride. And this should not be the case. It shouldn't be the case because we need to be remembering we're not the one who saved humanity. The best thing that we can do is point to the other. The best thing that we can do is to decrease ourselves that Christ may increase. And so we have that humility that we stumbled across something that we're able to share, and so we should. We have a packet of Tim Tams that never runs out. We share that as well and as comprehensively as we possibly can. Preparation 2. Pick 1 to 5 people, probably 1 to 5 people that you're close to, and pray for them each and every day. Doesn't need to be complicated. Can be very, very simple. We shouldn't be, as I've said to a number of people here before, we shouldn't be trying to prove how good a thesaurus we are, how good a dictionary we are. Instead, be as little children and come before the throne of our Father in heaven. Pray especially for their enlightenment. You can pray for other things as well, but especially for their enlightenment. If you're not sure where to start, I've put up a couple of Psalms that seem to me to be quite appropriate for this. They're both in the Septuagint numbering. So if you're looking at this with a standard, so to speak, a Protestant or Catholic Bible or one that you've picked up, then which way does it go? Add 1 number. So 96 and then 86 for those Bibles. But for the Septuagint or the Orthodox Study Bible, 95 for ourselves, 85 for others. Part 3 of preparation. So each of these things work together as necessary and ongoing means of preparing ourselves to share the gospel. To do our part in our church community, we make sure that visitors are welcomed. It's really easy for people to fall through the cracks. It's really easy for us to go, we're welcoming because everyone that we know is in a good conversation, but we've missed the guest. We've missed the one who didn't get LinkedIn and has already left. So make sure visitors are welcomed. Invite them to coffee hour or whatever equivalent there is, And sometimes the equivalent is, let's go to somewhere and have lunch or have coffee or speak. And when you're speaking to someone, practice if you must, but be 100% present and focused on the conversation. You're not trying to take this anywhere in particular. Just hear them. Hear them and interact. So, step 1 is our preparation. And then step 2, listen during conversations. Like, really listen. Be totally present and focused on the conversation. People do want to talk about big issues, in Australia as well. The idea that in Australia spirituality is dead is wrong. And I have many, many counterexamples. People want to talk about big issues. They don't always want to talk about the big issues right now. I think that's being human. But it is a possibility that these big issues will come up, that we will have something to speak into that. Now, if the conversation veers towards and then goes away, that's okay. The opportunity may never arise. That's okay too, because the point isn't to have the magic words. The point was always to love them. That starts with listening. It starts with listening, and then it moves to if there's a way that we can help, if there's a way that we can support the other, to encourage the other. The point is the other person. They are the image of God, and we are to treat them like they are the image of God. Now, there may be an opportunity for an opening. And when you start listening for this, and you start listening for when people want to hear more, you find it happens a lot more than you would think. If that happens, then share. Perhaps it's sharing your journey. Perhaps it's sharing something that's helped you, an understanding about the human person that's helped you. It could be any one of a number of things. But that may be the way that you're able to make that connection. I remember a time that I was talking to someone who was very, very into, not just into computers, but was a programmer working with the back end of programs. And he was talking about how in some parts of the back end of programs, it's unknowable and you're kind of guessing how your code can interface with the computer's code. And from there was a connection to we're doing our best to understand God and to follow his code of conduct. And we only know part of the details. And from there was became the bridge to a longer conversation. That conversation may never lead anywhere else, but we were able to talk in that moment. So that's an example of how we're able to share when an opening presents itself. From there, sometimes people are interested. Sometimes they want to know more. So if they are, there's a few possibilities, and each of them could be appropriate even successively. We can discuss further. Let's talk about some other things that are part of this. Or offer to connect them with someone else. Offer to come to church with them. And inviting them to services and events. It's important that whatever you invite them to is an event that they're able to participate in. It's going to feel very, very jarring if they come to an event. And remember, coming to church is weird for non-church people. It's weird the first time, at least. So look for as many opportunities as possible for it to be less weird. Don't look for the ones that are completely foreign in every way. So let's recap what we've learned from tonight. Firstly, we've learned that the mission of the church includes evangelism. That's the fullness of the church, includes evangelism. Secondly, that evangelism is sharing the gospel with someone who hasn't heard it, and it's a natural outflowing of our faith. That the prerequisites that we need for evangelism concerns the person of the evangelist, the priest, and the parish. And we know how important it is that for any ideas we have, that these be worked in with the parish priest and with his vision. We've learned that evangelism requires presenting the gospel in a way that whoever you're speaking to is able to feasibly accept. Not that they must accept it to be successful, but that they're able to accept it. Second, it requires communication. Third, it requires listening first and then speaking. And fourth, it requires to be ready with prayer, especially. Lastly, we evangelize through listening to others, and if it leads that way, to sharing our story. And secondly, by introducing them into your faith community. That's my talk for the evening. And I'm really hoping that we'll be able to have some questions, to have some discussions around this. I'm of the opinion that this is something that we tend not to discuss, and whatever it is that you're looking for more information on, or how we can apply this, I'm really looking forward to discussing that with you tonight. Thank you for taking the time on your Sunday evening. I know that you could be doing anything else, watching whatever, or going out wherever. Thank you for making this time.